Alright? Because we're looking at the Chora state from top to bottom. Okay? So, I think generally Bertenstein also gets a little bit of a bad reputation. He just gets very limited and confined to what we know about him. What do we know about Bertenstein's theory of the segmentary state? You can just summarize it in a few words. The main talking points. Yes?
There was a triangle,
so pyramids.
Pyramids.
Yes.
Even in a big triangle, there were
small triangles. Yes. So I think whenever we think of Bertenstein or whenever we think of the Chora state, immediately a triangle turns up, right? And it's generally the next thing our mind goes to is the idea of ritual sovereignty, right? And not very real power, right? So, and I think that this is a very cursory sort of reading of Bertenstein. So that's why I wanted to do a little bit more of Bertenstein's understanding of the Chora state and of the segmentary state before we move on to Heitzman. Because Heitzman and even interestingly B.D. Chattopadhyay do not totally disagree with Bertenstein. Like they have a lot of features that they pick up from his arguments, and that's why I think we need a better understanding of it. Alright. So, the segmentary state, as we mentioned in our previous meeting, is taken from whose general theory? Eden Southall, right? And for which society did he make? The Alur tribes of Africa, right? Keep that in mind. There's a racist point to be made over here. Alright. So he takes us from the theory made by Adrian Southall about the Alur tribe in Africa. Please try to be on time. Alright? And the reason why he had to come up with a new way of understanding medieval society is that at this point in time for South India, now for North India we know R. S. Sharma is doing his thing, and from East India we know that, not East, which is the other side, West. West India we know for the Rajput states, B.D. Chattopadhyay is coming up with his ideas. For Odisha we know Herman Fulke is coming up. But what about South India? South India, there wasn't much of a theoretical formulation on the nature of the state, except for scholars like K.A. Neelakant Shastri. Neelakant Shastri, have you guys heard of him?
Yes, sir.
What is he famous for? He wrote a book called The History of South India. And that itself should tell you that he likes broad, overarching and sweeping things, right? So he argues that in South India, and again, the idea being South India is everything, he says that it was a centralized bureaucratic state, right? There's not much nuance to it. Every place is centralized bureaucratic in some way or the other form, right? But there is no nuance. And this is what disturbed Bertenstein, and he needed to go further into understanding what this meant, alright? So, again, Bertenstein does believe in triangles, so let's not forget our pyramids, right? And each of these pyramids is known as a nada, right? So the most fundamental unit of the state, of a segment. So each segment is known as a nada. Okay? Multiple of these nada together make the Chora state. Alright? And these nada are basically mirror reflections of the structure of the state, right? So you have the ruler at the top, you have everybody else below it. Similarly, in the nada, you will have the administrator at the top. So generally, it was a group of people together who used to rule the nada, and below them you had everybody else who's working for them. And as we mentioned previously also, the belief is that militarily also these nada are self-sufficient, right? And that the state does not have a military apparatus of its own. It has a very small military apparatus, and it takes from the nada in order to finance or go ahead for any other military requirement it had. Okay? So, one of the issues that one can point out with these nada formations that Bertenstein talks about is that he says that these are political and social communities. Now the term community is what is problematic over here. Bertenstein does not want to look at these communities as representing particular castes or subcastes or groups. He says that these groups are more of a janapada rather than a jati. Like that's the term, that's the way he tries to explain it. He says, look at these communities as janapadas, as people, right? A people who have settled a particular land rather than jati, which brings in a certain degree of, let's say, division, diversity in that. Now, this formulation is what a lot of scholars have found problematic. Because if you are to argue, and I think in the previous meeting also we talked about this, how do you believe that some groups of people would willingly subjugate themselves to other groups of people? So when you're saying that this community is working together, living together, they are sharing resources, isn't it odd to say that everybody is at par with each other? So what Bertenstein is arguing is that in the Nada comprises of a sort of homogeneous community. These guys are possibly linked to each other through lineage ties, marriage, lineage, these sort of ties, right? Which makes it rather homogeneous. Now this, again, put a pin in this, is a problem because it is taking away from the kind of nuance that we can ascribe to a Nada. Again, remember, you will have people of different strata, you will have people, definitely you have the person at the top who is going to be hierarchically above those below. So how is it exactly that he is arguing for a homogeneous Nada? Right? This is one issue that we can ascribe to this theory. Alright. For understanding this topic, I want you guys to read. Have you read Bertenstein's article? So there's Herman Kulke's book, Society and State in India. It's an edited volume, and you'll find Bertenstein's revisions of thoughts on, I forget the name of the article, but it's basically the segmentary state and revisions of thoughts on the segmentary state. So it's basically him responding to a lot of criticism that he has received. Okay, so Herman Kulke's Society and State in India, you will find both the articles that you require for this portion. One is Bertenstein and the second is James Heitzman. It comes one after the other in the book. Alright, if anybody has any difficulty finding the book, please let me know and I can send it across as well. Alright, and this book is important. You'll need it for even Rajasthan and for Odisha and for everything else. So please do make sure that you get your hands on this book. So this is the general idea of the Nada. It is pyramidal. It has a ritual relationship between the main state and the Nada, right? Another thing we should remember, as the Nada goes further away, the ritual relationship also starts to thin out, right? Because you can't keep it that close together, right? And these Nada are a reflection, mirror reflection of the administrative body in the center. Okay, now Bertenstein, again, I would recommend, it's a little bit of a long read, but do read Bertenstein's own response to his critics because he's really angry and he doesn't take criticism really well. Okay, so he is very upset as having to explain himself to people, and he says that, so one of the criticisms, remember I pointed out racism earlier, right? So he says that when a lot of people have argued that you can't use a theory that was made to explain something in Africa for India. It's like, how dare? People have just gone wild. They're like, how could you use sub-Saharan Africa and India? They're not the same. How could you use a model? And he's like, that's a racist argument because you're very okay with using a European feudalism model in India. Right? So that is one of the arguments, one of the counter criticisms that he makes. Right? And so generally he kind of brushes off the arguments made by R.S. Sharma and others, but he does take two people rather seriously. He may not agree with them, but he does want to engage with their ideas, and those two people are Harbans Mukhya and B.D. Chattopadhyay. Okay? So these are two individuals who he does take seriously and he engages with them. Alright? Now, we know Mukhya's issue with the feudalism debate. What was Mukhya's issue with the feudalism debate?
The
Eurocentric approach, the fact that the Indian peasants have more access to their resources, they have, sorry? Mode of production, right? They are the owners of their modes of production, whereas in the European context, that is not the case. What about BDC? What is BDC's theory? The integration. Can somebody, we didn't discuss this in the last class, right? Can somebody just quickly run us through what BDC's integrated model is? It's alright if you don't know, you can say that also if you want.
We got to start with the integrative model. We did not discuss.
You've not done it last year? Huh?
He's saying that present and a decentralization of a
Right.
it is related to the extension of the state as well.
Right.
In the marginal area.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, B.D. Chattopadhyay, let's just quickly acquaint ourselves with this idea to get a sense of where he's coming from. Very correctly, as these guys mentioned, B.D. Chattopadhyay is arguing that, you remember the parcelization of power that R. Sharma talks about? He's like, yeah, land grants are going on. B.D. Chattopadhyay is not denying that. But he says, who says that that means that power is going away? Chattopadhyay argues that when you give power to somebody, they are indebted to you. So they are carrying your state's power to a further distance. So he sees the giving of land grants as something that is bringing the state together rather than breaking the state apart. Does this make sense? It might make sense. I mean, he says that there is the Samanta, our good friends, the Samantas. The Samantas are people who are working for the benefit of the state, right? They are representatives of the ruler working on behalf of the ruler. And we need to remember the Samantas because it's going to come back here, right? So if the Samantas are working on behalf of the ruler, they take land grants from him, they extend his power to a certain area. That's one argument. The second argument is, as opposed to R.S. Sharma, who says that trade is declining, money is declining, everything is dying, B.D. Chattopadhyay says, yeah, trade is declining, but that doesn't mean that everything is coming to an end. He is arguing that during this time there is an extension of inland trade, inward trade. So there's a lot of local trade coming, and because of that, local markets are burgeoning. So when local markets come up, the economy is flourishing on its own through that local trade. And again, there is trade with Southeast Asia, which for some reason everybody seems to forget, right? That is also happening during this time. So B.D. Chattopadhyay sees this period not as one of doom and decline the way in which R.S. Sharma sees it. He sees it in a very different way while accepting these arguments that there is a trade decline or there is the giving away of land grants. He sees it, he tries to look at it from a different perspective, alright? And you will be doing this in greater detail in your other lectures, right? But again, BDC does talk about Samantas, right? So keep that in mind, we're going to come to the Samantas in a minute. Alright. Okay. So Mukhya's basic question, because we know where he's or what line he's thinking of when he talks about the state, he is asking about analyzing the interests of those protected or those involved in the segmentary state. The farmers, those who are below the Nada rulers, right? What about these people? How do we look at them, right? And BDC's basic question is about lineage ties, right? How do we associate, how do we look at lineage ties within the framework of the segmentary state? So these are the two questions raised by Mukhya and BDC about these points which are there that we have to consider for medieval India, early medieval India, which don't seem to be obviously answered by the segmentary state. So Bertenstein is trying to incorporate that into his argument. Alright? Mukhya is basically, he wants to analyze the interests of those represented and protected in the segment. You remember earlier we were mentioning that it can't be homogeneous, right? There has to be some sort of diversity within that nada. So that is, those people are who he is talking about, right? Or even if you want to look at it very basically, these let's say administrative officers at the head of the nada, how are they related to the state? How are they protecting themselves and their sort of independence in the nada from the center? Yeah.
If we say that it is all about lineage ties,
Yeah.
as you say, and so how it's a homogeneous society, everyone is like same here.
Yeah.
So how can like there be a hierarchy of power within NAD and then at the central level? How can we set that up?
So yeah, that is what makes it a little difficult to accept, right? So within the nada, let's say even B.D. Chattopadhyay, when he looks at Rajputana, like when he looks at the Rajput states and the creation of the states, over there the lineage links are there, right? That is what makes the state, that is what makes the Rajput polity so strong. Now here he is arguing that each nada is a lineage society, right? And then they all owe ritual authority to the state. And they acknowledge the ritual authority of the state. Now, why should they? Is a very good question.
What is the source you're citing for this point that making those rituals for the...
So, the building of temples. So now, when we go into Heitzman and we will also look at Karashima, we will see how much temple building is very important in this. Especially when you look at Karashima's writing, Karashima starts off with temples. And he talks about the evolution of temples and how you can link that to the Chora state, right? So we look at that as well. Okay. So, in response to Mukhya, Bertenstein argues that in medieval India, we have to understand kingship in a very medieval Indian context. Right? He says that possibly throughout early medieval India, you will see across the board that there is a sort of hereditary link, right? That kingship is based on and develops through hereditary links. Okay, this is Bertenstein's basic argument that and it's across the board, it's across India. This is what you can see everywhere, right? That these hereditary links are what keep monarchy in place, right? And they controlled extensive amounts of land, these hereditary families, they controlled extensive amounts of land, and they were at the top of the pecking order. Okay? Hierarchically, these hereditary families who owned extensive amounts of land are at the top. Okay? And so how do they manage to stay at the top? Because there are smaller families below who owe allegiance to them, who possibly depend on them for their survival. So this is complicating matters further. We talked about the pyramidal nada, right? So here they're saying you have maybe a family who's at the top, right? And everybody within this structure owes their allegiance to this family because they are the ones who have the most extensive amount of land, right? So they are the rich ones. They are the ones who can offer you employment. They are the ones who can offer you protection. They will be the ones who can afford to maintain a military. So for many reasons, this family becomes the sort of hierarchical top and everybody owes their allegiance to them. Right? Now, let's multiply this onto a bigger scale. So when you come to the state, the Chora king is at the top and these families become his subservients. Alright? Does this make sense? Or should I do it once again? Once more? Alright? Okay, within the nada. So this is a nada. Let's take an example. Let's say this is a nada. Alright? This, I have the largest area, biggest table, right? So I have the most amount of land under my control. Right? I have control over your grades. Right? Let's say, so there's a different kinds of, I can close this door and suffocate you all to death and run away. Right? I have a lot of control over you. Right? So in order to keep me happy or in order to maintain yourselves, you will give allegiance to me because I am the most powerful. Right? Now I have to give allegiance somewhere because I can't survive on my own. Right? I have other Nadu who want to take over my land. So who do I give allegiance to? The principal. Right? He will make sure that nobody will take AS3 from me. Alright? This is the kind of structure that we are looking at. Right? And because of that, now does this in some way start to sound like the Samantha and center relation? Is what Bertenstein is arguing. In his explanation to BDC, he says, isn't this exactly how a Samantha is related to the center? They are an independent unit, possibly hereditarily related, right? Which owes allegiance to a higher authority, right? And within that small hereditary area, they are also small groups who owe allegiance to the biggest of the family members in that area. Does this make some sort of sense? Right? So basically, he takes the idea of the parcelization of power, the idea of land grants, which we associate with Samantas. Samantas are people who get land grants, who maintain military and owe their allegiance to the king. Now these Nada are very similarly smaller groups who have their own military capacity and owe their allegiance to the king. So this is how he responds to B.D. Chattopadhyay's arguments about the existence of Samanta or Samanta-like individuals within the early medieval state. Any doubts? Alright? Yes?
And did they also possess military power?
These Nada. The Nada or the... Yeah, the Nada had their own, the leader of the Nada. Do you not find your pen?
Yes.
It's a 3% operation. Alright. So the Nada technically has its own military. It does have its own way of policing, judiciary, everything on its own. And the center has a very small group. So whenever they need military help, they take it from the Nada. Which is, there is another, the Spencer's argument which says that no, these guys are marauders. They have a whole different situation altogether. Then there are other arguments which saying they know they have a proper standing army because look, the Cholas had a navy. Yes?
And the James Hyde in the last lecture told that he said that there was no standing military force, that the supreme authority, like these Nadas do have their military powers, but then the supreme authority that which only functions on the basis of patronizing the deity did not have their own standing act.
So again, like I said, different scholars have different opinions on this matter, right? There is a wide variety. Like some people say absolutely none. Some people say, look, they had to have a military because of the navy. They use the navy as an example to talk about the military. Others are like, no, nothing at all, right? Okay. Again, over here, Bertenstein wants to invite us to think about this in a particularly medieval sort of way. In the ancient period, what you've done, how did rulers get their authority? What gave a ruler the authority to rule?
Military might that they possessed.
Military might? Something more ephemeral.
Their religion.
Sorry? Yeah, Brahmanas.
The authenticity that they gather from popular culture. And
Popular culture, yes. Anything else? Yes.
Temple building.
Sorry, temple building. Anything else? What is the ritual that they use? They would use Vedic rituals like the Ashwamedha, like the Rajasuya, in various ways. So you have these larger kings who would use these traditions, the ritual traditions of Ashwamedha, Rajasuya and others, to declare themselves as rulers. And these guys, on the top of the Nada, they would use smaller rituals to kind of establish themselves. Alright? And then there is that ritual connection that is created between them as well. Okay, Bertenstein invites us to think of that as well. Okay? Okay. Now, Bertenstein also argues that if you look at the Chora state, right, different points of time and in different geographical regions, you will start to see variations. And this is something that Heitzman picks up on. And it's a very important argument. Alright? Now, just a little bit geographically, I don't think we've managed to, or we have discussed where these guys are. The Cholas we generally assume are where?
Not
Yes?
where today is northern Tamil Nadu region. That is
Andhra Tamil region. Alright, can you give me some rivers? Kaveri River, alright. Kaveri. Let's do. Right? So the Kaveri basin is the area which we identify as the core area of the Cholas. Right? So the Kaveri basin, I will have to subject you to my drawing of the coast of India. So there is, on the Tamil coast, there's a little bit like this. If you ever, yeah. And the Kaveri basin flows like this, and there's a lot of little tributary rivers you'll see. So this area, the Kaveri basin, is where we can identify the center or the core of the Chola Mandala. Okay? The two other regions come to the north and the south of this area. Right? And in the north, you have the river of Ponnaya. Yeah, Ponnaya river. Sorry? Ponnaya? Ah, yeah. Ponnaya and the Cheyyar rivers. These are to the north. And to the south, you have the rivers of Vaigai and Tamrabarni, right? So these are the Kaveri main region. To the north, you have the Ponniyar and the Cheyyar rivers, and to the south, you have the Vaigai and the Tamrabarni rivers. All right. If anybody here speaks Tamil and my pronunciation is wrong, do feel free to correct me. Right. So this is generally the geographical extent of the Chola state that we're looking at this point of time. This is, let's say, from the 10th to the 13th centuries. This is the extent of the state. Right? So, Ponniyar, Cheyyar in the north, Vaigai and Tamrabarni in the south, and the Kaveri being the core region. Now remember this also because Heitzman uses the same sort of geographical layout to explain his theory as well. Somebody had a doubt? Somebody had something to say? Now, we hear, Bertenstein tells us that the Cholas are extensively invested in agriculture in this area. These are very fertile lands, right? And therefore, the Cholas spend a lot of time taking their revenue from the agricultural output of this area. Okay? Now, he also argues, and this is where again a lot of criticism has come to Bertenstein, that the agricultural output of this area was because of a good relationship between the Brahmanas and the Vellalas. Okay? Who are the Vellala? The peasants, right? They're a peasant caste. They are an agricultural caste in Tamil Nadu, and the Brahmanas are the Brahmanas, right? So, again, the question that we can ask Bertenstein, why would anybody willingly subject themselves to the authority of someone else, right? So that is why, but he says that, again, when you talk about good agricultural output, he says it's because of a great relationship between the Brahmanas and the Vellalas that a decent harvest is possible and the state can make money out of this. Alright? The main point that I would like to focus on in Bertenstein's formulation is the fact that he says that in the core region, society is extremely hierarchically divided. Right? You can see very clear signs of hierarchy. And I think I mentioned this, I may not have. In South India, how many castes are there? What is the caste division system like in South India? And what is that? Okay, that is a different, but in general, like we know the fourfold caste system. Does that apply to the South?
Yes, there are four groups which are in Tamil Nadu. And one was Kerala, there, I don't remember the names, there are four groups in the caste system.
Right. In the South, you have mainly two divisions: Brahmins, non-Brahmins. Right? If you are not a Brahmin, you are everybody else. Alright? So the South has this division. So everybody else that you see, the Vellalas and everyone else, now this is not to say that there is no hierarchy in the rest of it. There is definitely a hierarchy, but it is Brahmins and non-Brahmins. Okay? This is the basic division you have in the South. Okay? And this is important because somebody here had mentioned the Idangai and Valangai. Sorry. Idangai and Valangai. Right? Idangai means what? Left hand. Valangai, right hand. What do we associate Valangai with? Food eating. We eat with our right hand. Right? How many of you have been smacked for eating with your left hand? There we go. Right? So, why is it that you get smacked for eating with your left hand? Because unmentionable things are done with your left hand. Right? So, therefore, this translates into the way in which we understand these caste divisions as well. Right? Those who are in the Idangai castes are those who did tasks which were menial. And those who were associated with the Valangai castes are those who did respectable jobs. Right? In some places you will see it being written that the Idangai castes did things like metallurgy and they were involved in bronze, brass, that sort of thing, whereas the Valangai castes were agriculturalists. Now, this sort of neat division is also rather simplistic because the Idangai-Valangai dichotomy also has, like, there are 69 different castes within the Valangai and similarly with the Idangai, but so we're not going to go into that much detail on it. It's just that what Bertenstein argues is that in the core you see a proper hierarchization of caste, of society, but as you go into the peripheral regions, it becomes very simplistically differentiated between Idangai and Valangai. Okay, so that sort of nuanced hierarchization that you see in the core, you do not see in the periphery. And it's possibly there in the core because of the influence of the state, because of the influence of Brahmins, because of the temple culture there, that you have that sort of culture coming up in the core and not so much in the periphery. Is this clear? So again, not only the core and the periphery, geographically, when geography changes, the relationship of the Nadu in that area changes to the state. This is also something that Bertenstein points out. He said that when you go to drier regions, now all of these that we've mentioned are on the river banks, right? They are on the river basins. But when you go towards drier regions, and I think this argument comes most because Bertenstein didn't stop with the Cholas, he's taken the segmentary state to the Vijayanagara Empire also, right? So over there he sees a very different sort of relationship when these peripheral regions are on the drier belts and their relationship, how that changes with the center depending on the geography and therefore the access to resources and the resources that they can produce. Alright? So basically, to sum up, we can say that the nature of the relationship of the state to the intermediaries was based on geography. Right? This is something that I think we don't talk about when we just talk about triangles, right? That there are nuances to that relationship with the state, and this is based, one, primarily on geography. Okay? Now coming to military organization, as we mentioned before, there are large numbers of local militia in the Nadu. So local militia is how we take care of the state. local communities take care of it, and a small group under the state, right? Again, this is Bertenstein's argument. As many of you pointed out, some say there are none, some say there are a lot. Right? This is Bertenstein's point of view. And these troops under the state are called the Vellaikar. These are the military individuals maintained by the center, right? Whereas you have local militia under the Nadu. The Vellaikar are under the central state. And these Vellaikar come from an area which we will discuss in greater detail called the Valanadu. Alright? The Valanadu is an intermediary area. We will discuss the Valanadu in extensive detail, right? But remember that the Vellaikar, which are the central military force, are taken from the Valanadu. Now, according to Bertenstein, over time, one of the major changes that you can notice in the period of the Chola state is the function and being of the temple. We know that the Cholas are extensively dependent on the temples. We know that they built temples and everything. You guys are familiar with the temple economy? The redistributive economy of the temple, right? All of you are. So he says that that is very basic. That's what we expect. Over time, you start to see a small change. Though the temple still exists, it becomes more of a civil authority. According to Bertenstein, he sees it as a civil authority where they are invested in political, commercial, and even administrative activities. So they are pretty much working alongside the state, not necessarily in a purely religious capacity, but also in an administrative capacity as well, right? So the state observes, so Bertenstein observes a change in the role of the temple during this time. All right. So this is a slightly more detailed look at what Bertenstein has to say. Let's just quickly, because we have a few more minutes, start off with what James Heitzman wants to look at in his analysis of the Chola state. Now, one of the fundamental problems that we've had with Bertenstein is his tendency to homogenize the people of the state, right? So the first question that Heitzman asks is, what mechanisms are used by the state to control large areas with a disparate population? We've just looked at how vast the state is. Obviously, it will not have a homogeneous population, right? The people, their culture will change within this large area. So Heitzman asks the first question, what does the state do in order to keep these people together? All right, or to keep them under control. Secondly, he asks that how do we understand the relationship of the king to the people and the authority that he has over them as we move further and further away, right? Even in Bertenstein's theory, we've talked about ritual sovereignty. But we've also acknowledged that as you move away from the center, ritual sovereignty becomes thinner and thinner, right? You can tend to, or you can ignore this ruler the further away from the center that you go. So again, Heitzman is asking a very simple question, what therefore is the mechanism? Because I think a number of you also raised this question. Why would a state, a Nadu so far away, listen to the center? Right? So, but they did. Now Heitzman wants to find out why. Okay? And the third question that he's asking is, what is the relationship between the local intermediaries and the royal political system? So the locals and the center, how do they maintain their relationship? What kind of a relationship? Is it cooperation? Is it coercion? What's happening? Right? These are the three main questions that he is trying to assess in his study of the Chora state. And he chooses to study the Chora state because he says there's a wide variety and a wide, extensive amounts of records that are available. From the temple records to what's written on the temple walls. There's so much of information that he wants to use that, right? Alright. One major problem that Heitzman sees is that the state has a problem. The state has a problem in terms of trying to control far-flung regions. Okay, so the areas are far away. The areas are ecologically different. Some are dry, some are in river basins, some are on hilly parts. Right? So ecologically different, far-flung regions with disparate populations, not a homogeneous population with a heterogeneous population. Right? This is the issue of the state. How do you now think of the state of our country? We have people who live on the coast. We have people who live in the dry deserts. We have people who live on the hilltops. Right? How is it that you keep everybody together? Again, language, culture, diversity. How is it possible? Now, Heitzman sees this. He says that how is it possible to do this through communication? How do you communicate with these disparate groups? And what kind of social relations can you actually foster in this sort of a situation? So, one way that he identifies the way that this can be done is if the center has a good relationship with the intermediaries. Okay, now who are these intermediaries? The intermediaries can be everybody from the rich peasants. Rich peasants are obviously somebody who the state will try to reach out to. You have dominant caste groups. So people like the Vellalas, maybe at some point of time when we discuss Karashima, you will see that a lot of the state policies were determined because of the way in which the Vellalas reacted to the state. Alright, so one thing you can see, rich peasants, the dominant groups like the Vellalas or the dominant communities, right? And their relationship with the people below them, with the intermediaries below them, right? So it's basically a chain that we're trying to look at. Who is related to whom? How can they get their point across, right? How far can we take this? So, generally, to summarize this point, it's a relationship between the center and the state at multiple levels, right? So think of it as panchayat, village, right? We're coming up to state and then going up beyond that, right? So how is it at multiple levels that a relationship is maintained? Alright. In his study, James Heitzman wants to look at various theories that have already been postulated. One is the bureaucratic state theory. What is the bureaucratic state theory? Any idea? The clue is in the name. Bureaucracy? Bureaucracy? No? So basically a state which functions like the one we are in currently, where there is a center and it kind of determines how everybody else works. He's looking at that, he's looking at the segmentary state theory, and he's looking at the feudalism model. Right? And while all of these theories are looking at the nature of the relationship between the center and the periphery, it doesn't exactly explain how. Right? And it doesn't again look at the kind of nuances that Heitzman wants to go into. Alright? Alright, I'll pause here and we'll start off with Heitzman properly the next time. Alright? In the meanwhile, please do read the articles. It will make it a little bit more clear.